From the end of March to the beginning of May of this year, I read 8 Black British books. And I set myself this challenge because I realized I'd just been severely lacking reading Black British stories and Black British authors. So I set myself out on a challenge to only read that for a little while. And I want to talk about it. I did have a previous video where I discussed which books I was planning to read and how I chose them, how I was feeling about them before reading. And I've been gone for a while. I'm sorry. I have been entirely consumed with a special interest for Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles. It's really bad. It's like all that I can think about, that and the TV show. So filming a YouTube video has been at the back of my mind. It's not what I wanted to do, but I have pulled myself out from the Vampire Chronicles hole. I've also been reading The Count of Monte Cristo on the side as part of a big read book club. So every week we've been reading maybe 100 pages or so. And it's just meant that the idea of reading anything else or filming a YouTube video has definitely been on the back of my mind. But one thing I wanted to do was definitely wrap up my overall thoughts on these 8 books. So I have 5 of them here, 5 of them that I bought specifically for this challenge and 3 more that I borrowed from the library. Hello, Editing Jace here to talk about the fact I forgot about a whole book that I DNF'd during this challenge, and that was Are We Home Yet by Katie Massey. I got around 30% through this book and I just wasn't meshing with it, so I DNF'd. And I completely forgot to talk about it in this video, so there is a secret 9th book that I will not be talking about in depth, sorry, just wasn't my type of book. And I'm gonna go through them, what I thought about them, starting from my least favorite to my most favorite. I actually have 2 that I rated the lowest. The lowest rating that any of these books got were 2.5 out of 5. I'm gonna talk about Rainbow Milk by, the author has changed their name actually, let me double check what it is, by Taino Mendez. I remember being distinctly confused by what exactly the timeline or main character of this story was supposed to be, and that was entirely judging from the blurb. So I went in very open-minded, very willing to just kind of throw away any expectations that I had because I didn't really know what to expect. This starts off as a very slow burn book and I really enjoyed it. I'd say that the beginning portion of the book was my favorite. The way that Rainbow Milk is described is as an intersectional coming-of-age story whose main character is a 19-year-old Jesse McCartney who is kind of grappling with his identity in terms of his race and his sexuality, as he's brought up very heavily religious, specifically Jehovah's Witness, and paving a new life for himself once he leaves his family. But what was described in the blurb was also in the Black country in the 1950s is an ex-boxer, somehow related or not necessarily related family-wise to Jesse, Norman, who has moved from Jamaica to Britain to better provide for his family. We actually start off in Jamaica for a little while learning about Norman and his family, and I just loved this part. This part was so rich and beautifully written, really emotive. It really took its time to flourish. However, once we get past Norman's story and we switch to Jesse, I found this switch to be really difficult and it took me a little while to become re-engaged in his story. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to understand the thread of connection we were supposed to feel between Norman in the 1950s and Jesse in the 2000s. I'm not sure if we were supposed to feel that connection. We're not necessarily supposed to know exactly how they're connected, but I think the change of pace was very noticeable to me. I think around halfway through the book, I settled more into Jesse's narrative, the story that he was telling, and it was really heartbreaking at some points. And even more so when, after finishing the book, I researched it and realized that this is actually a semi-autobiographical book, which did explain some of the narrative choices made. There are a few time skips in this book, and there was a final time skip to 2016, and this is where I think the book sadly entirely lost me. I remember thinking that the end portion of this book was just so dull, and it was really frustrating because this is actually where we find out how Norman and Jesse are linked. I think that a lot of this book perhaps needed more harsher editing to help really cut through to the heart of the story and help with this somewhat meandering third act that really disengaged me from the book overall. I don't know as an editor how difficult it is to be editing semi-autobiographical fiction as well, because a lot of that must be incredibly personal to the author and you probably don't want to step on their toes. videos. But yeah, I think this book was too long, too meandering, and unfortunately just wasn't really my thing either. I really thought that from looking at the appearance of this book and how the blurb sounded, that this would be really up my street, and it really wasn't, so that was sad. Another book that I rated 2.5 stars out of 5 was Lote by Shola von Reinhold. I was so disappointed that I didn't like this one as much as I did. Unfortunately, this is a book that made me feel so stupid. I don't know what was going on for half of this book, and it kind of kills me that I couldn't interpret it in a way that connected with me, and I really wanted to connect with it. How do I explain this book? Because I certainly didn't explain it very well in my first video. Our main character is Matilda, who very much becomes enamored, fixated, develops a special interest even with a black modernist poet called Hermia Druitt, and she is like a forgotten figure of British history in the 1920s period. And Matilda also has these fixations on other figures within this period. They're called the bright young things of the 1920s. So when Matilda finds out there's this really remote artist's residency set in one of the European towns that Hermia, her main fixation, was supposed to have lived in the 1930s, she applies and gets in. So we follow her as she goes to this residency and meets like a whole host of really bizarre characters and uncovers this sort of secret society, and we're not really sure how hinged Matilda is as a character. I do love a lot of the characterization in this book. I think it was really funny. It was incredibly queer, which I love. I just think there were a lot of philosophical ideas that I was not familiar with. Again, this is why it made me feel it made me feel stupid. It made me feel really out of my depth. I'll talk about what I enjoyed. What I enjoyed is the different modes of narrative, I suppose, that were employed. So here you'll see a completely different way formatting on the page, and this is because we're reading what Matilda is reading, which is a book on Black modernisms, and we get segments of this book throughout the book where you're essentially put that's my rice cooker, where we're essentially put into Matilda's head as she's reading a book, and it's really fascinating because this is interrupted as certain characters come in. For example, you know that she's just been interrupted reading alone in her room, and it's great because we get to see exactly what Matilda is reading about her fixations, her muses. Firsthand, we get to read it without Matilda's interpretation or her glorification, perhaps, of these people. Because it's been a little while since I've read this book, I'm trying to remember, there's also this formatting where you have these censored bars at the top, which is also different formatting. I cannot remember what this is supposed to indicate. It might be her reading another book. I can't remember. I feel like this just goes down a rabbit hole that I was not appreciating. I didn't understand enough of what was going on to really get a huge amount of enjoyment from it, which is a shame because I think plot-wise it was definitely something I thought I would be more interested in, and being told from a black queer perspective was something I really wanted to read more of. I just don't think it hit the mark for me, to the point where I ended up becoming really disengaged and uninterested in the book because it was so high concept that I didn't even know what we were talking about anymore, what time of the day it was, things like that. There were some segments of the book I really enjoyed. There's another character called Griselda who Matilda kind of makes friends and enemies with. I loved their dynamic, and I really liked it when they went around researching more about the poet together. There's some really funny characterization of these characters called Elizabeth/Joan, because the main character can't remember what her name is, and also Agnes, who's this older woman. I think ultimately Matilda is quite a difficult character to vouch for, to become invested in. I don't truly sympathize with her or understand what her motives were as we got further through the book. There's obviously this overarching goal for her to learn more about her muses, and in particular Hermia Druitt. But as things became more difficult in the narrative, Matilda's motivations also became very difficult for me to pass through, so I think I ended up ultimately becoming disengaged. And it's a shame, because what a beautiful book as well. So beautiful. There is definitely a target audience for this book who probably have more time for understanding and reading through philosophy than I do. This was just very high concept for me. I'm happy to say that I am not clever enough for this book, but this is why you challenge yourself. This is why you try something different. So yeah, 2.5 stars out of 5. I wanted more from it and I couldn't get more from it. It's really bizarre. If you like a bizarre book, go for it. This is absolutely now going to have to be a video filmed in 2 parts because I'm seeing a movie in an hour. I cannot talk about these books in 1 hour. But the next book is The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney by Okechukwu Nzelu. I was so excited for this one, but obviously being the third book that I'm talking about, it is not the highest rated book, which I'm really sad about, but also not because this was his first book, so I did expect that his more recent book, Here Again Now, which I absolutely loved, would likely be of a different style or maybe a bit more developed. I still enjoyed this book. I gave it 3 stars out of 5. This is a good book. Very much a story about racial identity, another coming-of-age story from our character Nnenna Maloney. However, this narrative is also split between Nnenna's white mother, Joni, and discusses a little bit her relationship with Nnenna's father, going back and forth in the narrative. That's not necessarily the main focus of the book. Really, it's about Nnenna's Igbo Nigerian identity and kind of her lack of connection to that culture that she felt she never really had the chance to explore. This book is beautiful at times, some really lovely writing. However, I think this is another meandering book. It kind of just doesn't do much some of the time, and it really detracts from what should be interesting. It probably could be a much shorter book, in my opinion. I think Nnenna is the most interesting, engaging character. It's kind of sold to be about Nnenna and her journey towards learning more about her culture, connecting with her culture and understanding where she's come from, and trying to crack open her history through a mother who is very repressed and doesn't seem to really want to share what happened between her and her father. I don't think we spent enough time with Nnenna. We had a lot of Joni, the mother's character. I felt as though as we came to the climax of the book, there was almost an expectation for there to be a big reveal about what exactly has happened to Nnenna's father. The thing is, we already know what happens to her father, so it feels structurally almost as though it's building towards something that doesn't need to be revealed. And this definitely adds to this meandering sense. It's a build up to something that we know, so this doesn't really feel like there's many stakes. There are a lot of different perspectives in this book, and I think it is not stronger for it. Unfortunately, we get a lot of Nnenna's friends' perspectives, even a single chapter from one of her friends, I think, and it just didn't work for me because I feel the pacing suffered for it to include different perspectives of characters we didn't necessarily need the perspective of. I feel like Nnenna and Joni were providing enough. The heart of the book really was Nnenna and Joni's relationship, and also when we went to the past to hear about Joni and Morris, Nnenna's father, how they met and how their relationship built up. We did also have Joni's gay best friend Jonathan, who was an interesting character to have. I did enjoy his sections, but it felt like a completely different book when I was in it. I think this is a great debut, but for me, having read Here Again Now, his next book, it just doesn't compare, and I would recommend Here Again Now over The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. The next book I rated 3.5 out of 5 stars, and that is Mask Off, Masculinity Redefined by JJ Bowler. I was so excited for this book, and I was absolutely misled by the fact that the colours of this book are pink, white, and blue. I thought it was trans. This is what happens when you don't do a lot of research into books for fear of being spoilt, but also this is a non-fiction book, so I don't know exactly why I felt I would be spoiled if I looked into the background of the author a bit deeper than I did. Don't get me wrong, this is still a good book, 3.5. I thought this would be a good exploration into Black masculinity, Black British masculinity in particular, but I think that I was projecting my expectations and what I wanted to read onto a book that already exists and is perfectly fine by itself, but is not what I wanted from it. I think this is a really decent beginner book if you want to teach men in your life about masculinity, patriarchy, and feminism. However, I don't feel that this is anything revolutionary necessarily for those who have an understanding of masculinity. I wouldn't say that this is groundbreaking if you have read any feminist literature before or have a greater cultural understanding around misogyny. There were like little tidbits of discussions of culture and how different cultures and backgrounds would influence the way in which you treat women and also the way in which you would perform masculinity, which was super interesting, and I think I'd hoped for more of that to inform the narrative as opposed to what it ended up being. There were a few personal anecdotes from JJ Bowler which were perfect, exactly what I was looking for. If I were to name the type of book that I was expecting, it would be something more along the lines of maybe Transitional by Munro Bergdorf or Love in Exile by Sean Fay. They are writers who weave in political commentary and learnings into their personal stories, and I think that is a super engaging way to learn about new things and to understand people's backgrounds, cultures, their perspectives, because it's very personal to them. This is not this type of book. So it was my mistake. I should have done more research. I would say it's a great book for younger or teenage boys who are coming to grips with the basics of misogyny, patriarchy, feminism in a very compassionate, accessible format. This is a very compassionate book. It doesn't talk down to you. It doesn't say that you're a bad person for not knowing these concepts or not being familiar with recognizing how these things are so prevalent in our life if you've never been brought up to question it. So yeah, good, but quite basic. Just a very pretty book in general though. I'm happy I own it. It looks nice. The final 3 books are all tied at 4.5 stars. Nothing ranked a 5-star, but I think a reread might make this a 5-star. So should I talk about it now or should I talk about it last? I'm going to talk about it now. Fuck the least to most favourite system, whatever. I want to talk about The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin. What's a gem. I've really enjoyed this book. I was not expecting to because there is something in my brain that tells me when I see like a penguin and it looks like a classic that I'm not going to enjoy it, and it is this very deeply held mindset I have of classics being boring, but that was because I was never reading classics that I found interesting, or I was not engaging with the classics in a way that were interesting for me. This is also a Penguin modern classic. I'm much more open to modern classics. Daphne du Maurier, for example, wrote a lot of modern classics and she's one of my favourite authors. So I think reading Rebecca opened up my perspective to classics and how much I would actually enjoy them. But this was a book that came up time and time again when I was doing my research on Black British writers. But really this book is about the Windrush generation in 1950s London, and we follow Moses, who has lived in London for a few years now, as he meets some new arrivals from Jamaica to London and kind of shows them the ropes around London. So we've got a very cynical, worn down narrator showing these, these hopeful new arrivals around the city and how things work when you are a Jamaican black man living in London. This is just such a beautiful book. It's really heartwarming and heartbreaking in equal measure for me. The ending had me tearing up, and I used to be someone who did not cry very easily at books. And when I say cry, I mean mostly tearing up. I think it's been a long time since I've sobbed at a book, for example. More recently, I've definitely been more emotional and tearful when reading certain books, but I wasn't expecting for this one to hit me as much as it did. I don't know if it was garnering that type of response. It wasn't something like a character death, for example, or something really tragic happened. It was something very toned down in nature, and that almost made it more emotional. Weirdly enough, for all the criticisms I've had about previous books in this video discussing how they're meandering, it doesn't really feel like you know where the narrative is going. This is the most meandering book I've ever read, and I loved it for it. It's incredibly deliberate in its lack of plots, because you are just following these men as they wander about and live their lives in London and the struggles that they face, but also the solidarity and the companionship that they find through their joint struggles. The ending essentially has Moses's friends come round into a circle to discuss how their weeks went, and Moses would hesitate to call him their friends. He's the kind of narrator he's a very tough love kind of guy, but yeah, them coming together to discuss about their struggles and the joys of their week, and it's set against the backdrop of Moses's musings of how miserable and such a lonely city London is. It was just really emotional to me. There is a portion of this book that I did struggle with. It's the summer portion of the book, and it is one long sentence and it is quite tough to get through. I don't think it did much for me narratively. The only other major criticisms that I have for this book is the way that women are discussed and treated in this book. You've got to remember, this is still written by a man and is a book about men, first published in 1956. So the discussion of women is something that you grit your teeth through. It is not very fun to read, but it captures very well, I think, men's perceptions of women at that time, and still to this day probably. That being said, I cannot deny that this is a beautiful little book, one of my favourites I've read this year, and definitely one of the favourites of this challenge. In fact, I will say it was my favourite of the challenge. I did actually miss one of the books. My maths again is failing me. But I forgot to talk about Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. This one was a 3.5 stars out of 5, so it should have been lower down in the list. I have heard and read so much about this book over my time. I've seen it in so many different libraries, and I've always meant to pick it up, and I just never did. And I totally understand why Girl, Woman, Other is so popular. I think it is mostly really well written and very accessible. What I loved about this book is that Evaristo is clearly very talented at writing complex and sometimes unlikable characters. Then she's able to bring the plot back round again for us to at the very least be able to empathize with the characters despite what they may have said or done earlier in the story. There were a few narrators that I was really not vibing with, but I could see their complexity and I could understand perhaps the motive behind what they were thinking or doing. The reason that this wasn't higher rated for me is because I think there were too many characters. This seems to be quite a common criticism that I have nowadays of there being too many characters, too many plot points, too many perspectives. I think it's quite a hard thing to pull off successfully and keep the reader engaged and caring about all the characters that you're introducing. From my memory, some of these characters are very much interlinked. I think we have, for example, a mother and then the next chapter is a daughter. So you can't really make the argument that you don't need to remember each character throughout each story. There is definitely a benefit to retaining a lot of that information. For me, I ended up feeling not very grounded in the story. There's a section where there's an after party and a lot of the characters are together in the same room, and I just had no clue really what to feel or who to care about. It ended up disengaging me quite a lot. And I didn't feel much closure as a reader, but I did really enjoy the final chapter with one of the characters, Penelope. I think mostly this ended up feeling like a very disjointed read. Nevertheless, I obviously still enjoyed it. 3.5 stars is not a bad rating. But for me, it went on for a little bit too long, and I think the range of characters was too much for me to feel engaged for the entire story. The second to last book that I'm going to talk about is None of the Above. Reflections on Life Beyond the Binary by Travis Alabanza. This was a 4.5 stars. Lovely. I love me a non-fiction. Another book that I've been meaning to read for so long. I picked this up from the library and I have no regrets. Travis Alabanza has such a compelling way of writing that really captures your attention and your empathy, your sympathy, everything. I love the way that they write. I think it's incredibly accessible and also really personable. The way that this book was structured in kind of different phrases that people would say, either good or bad, about Travis or about Travis's community was also really heartwarming and heartbreaking. There were so many sentiments and phrases that I've heard myself. So to see someone analyze and almost reply to those phrases in a compassionate but measured way felt somewhat healing. I don't know if that was the intention of the book, but definitely felt a lot of solidarity and made me feel less alone, which is always a lovely thing. Last but certainly not least is Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson. This was another one I was so incredibly excited to read because I have previously read Small Worlds by the same author and I loved it so much. Ooh, the lighting is going insane. The sun has decided to come out. I don't know how to fix this. Okay, change of angle because I had to deal with the lighting. But this is his debut novel and I've already read Small Worlds and loved it so much. I believe that was a 5-star for me, if not definitely a 4.5. This was a 4.5. I do love it, just not as much as I loved Small Worlds. So again, similar to Nazelia's book, I feel like I read the better book first, so then I had really high expectations and they were not let down, but I've definitely come out of this experience with a preference of books between these authors. I am never 100% sure how I feel about second person narratives, so the entire book is written as you went to see this girl, she said this and you went home with her, that kind of vibe. It doesn't always work for me. I think it worked really well in this book and I'm not sure how different it would have been if we had third person narrative or an omniscient narrator, for example. I think for me the characters were just not as compelling as I found the ones in Small Worlds, but still really beautiful, still a lot of moments that had me tearing up and feeling super emotional. Overall, just such a beautiful lyrical writer. I'm so excited to see what more comes from Caleb Azuma Nelson, and I believe this is being adapted into a TV show. Yes, the casting was released a few weeks ago and I think it's currently being filmed, so I will definitely be tuning in to watch this on TV. Still a 4.5, I would still absolutely recommend anyone who wants to get into Black British literature, particularly very lyrical, romantic, but also grounded fiction. This is absolutely a book for you. I would always recommend Caleb Azuma Nelson's books. That's it. Those are all the books I read. They're the ones that I own. I had such a mixed experience doing this challenge, but I would do it again in a heartbeat, and I will probably explore different countries, or maybe even do the same thing again, maybe place more limitations. So maybe, for example, only doing female Black writers, female Black British writers, poetry, some things like that. I have a few ideas of what I might want to do, because I do find myself setting these challenges to be way more engaging and fulfilling than if I were to just pick random books off my bookshelf, and almost limiting myself in that way to certain genres or certain writers definitely expands my horizons when it comes to reading, and I love it so much. I would always recommend doing that if you ever feel disenfranchised with reading or feel like you're in a slump. Sometimes setting some barriers to it helps re-engage you. It's great. So this is my review of all the Black British books that I read a few months ago. Sorry that I did not film this sooner when I had a better memory of what happens in said books. The vampire brain parasite has taken over, so I hope you enjoyed this video and it wasn't too awkward after months of not filming. I will see you soon. Bye bye.